I recently sailed throughout the British Isles, Norway, and the Mediterranean on 3 different cruise lines and learned a lot of valuable lessons about cruising Europe in the process. A few were pleasant surprises, but a lot of lessons were very frustrating and led to some stressful close calls. After doing guided land tours of Western Europe many years ago, I thought I had a head start with what I needed to know about traveling throughout Europe. Those experiences led to assumptions about ports and getting around that ended up being very, very wrong. In this episode of The Chill Cruiser, I'll explore the 20 lessons I learned cruising Europe about the cruise lines themselves, to ports, hotels, saving on roaming fees, and just getting around. If you're planning a European cruise for the first time or thinking about it, you're not going to want to miss this. Hey cruisers, Andrew from Toronto, Canada here. Welcome to The Chill Cruiser, where I explore cruising from a chill perspective. Today I'm going to share the many lessons I learned cruising Europe last summer. I went on a very ambitious adventure where I cruised for 2 months through Norway, the British Isles, and the Mediterranean on 4 different cruise ships from 3 different cruise lines, on top of a lot of planes, trains, and automobiles. I ended up visiting more than 70 cities in 15 countries. I thought I had a bit of a head start with planning since I did a land tour of Western Europe many years ago and experienced a lot of the differences getting around versus North America and other countries. It turns out those experiences didn't at all prepare me for traveling Europe on a cruise ship. I'll walk you through my 20 plus valuable lessons in areas like cultural differences, cell phones, hotels, trains, airlines, and of course, cruise lines. I'll start with planning. My first lesson was a big one and might not be popular. It's that cruising isn't a great way to visit many European cities. I hate to say it because I absolutely love cruising, but in many places, the size of the ships and the cruise lines themselves don't make it easy to enjoy many of the places they visit. The best part of visiting Europe is immersing yourself in the history and culture, getting lost, exploring, relaxing at a cafe, and it can be tough to do that when you spend half the day on a tender boat and a bus and you're constantly checking your watch. In some ports like Vigo, Spain, the ships dock in a central area, and you can walk off and explore the city at your leisure. But there are many other ports that cruise lines sell as major destinations like Rome and Paris, when in reality they're 2 hours away and it takes a lot of work to actually visit Rome and Paris after the cruise ship docks. The Eiffel Tower is 200 kilometers or 125 miles from Le Havre cruise port and takes up to 2.5 hours by train. Rome's Colosseum is 90 kilometers or 56 miles from Civitavecchia cruise port and can take up to 2 hours by train. I thought this was a rare exception with cruising Europe, but it's actually very common in ports throughout the British Isles and the Mediterranean. Edinburgh, Scotland was a great example. Our cruise anchored outside the small town of Queensferry, which is 10 plus miles away. It was a half-hour experience to get a tender boat to shore, and then if you didn't have a shore excursion booked to get you to Edinburgh, you either had to wait in a massive lineup in the rain for a shuttle bus or hike through the forest and up a hill to the local train station. In the end, it took an hour and a half just to get into the city, and while you're exploring, you have that return trip in the back of your mind. Our cruise itinerary made it appear like we had a lot of time to explore and make the trip back and forth, but it was a bit deceiving. The itinerary said we were docked until 7 p.m., but you actually had to return to the port at least an hour before that to catch the last tender boat to the ship. Edinburgh is definitely a city where you really need to book a shore excursion to take the work of planning away and enjoy the little time you have there. But those excursions are expensive. For Edinburgh alone, the cheapest excursion was $100+ per person. When you have many ports like this on your itinerary, your excursions budget can easily double or triple the cost of your vacation. When you factor these costs into your budget, it can easily offset the cost advantages of cruising, especially when it's so easy to get around in Europe. River cruise boats can often get much closer to major ports and include some excursions, but are usually much more expensive than cruise ships. But there are definitely some amazing cruise ship-friendly ports that allow you to get a flavor for the area. If you manage to find a cruise itinerary that stops at those ports and stay a few nights before or after your cruise, you can still plan a great visit to Europe. It just takes a lot of work and planning, and it can get very expensive. Hopefully the lessons I'm about to share will help you with that planning process. My second lesson was that the time of year you visit can make a big difference on your experience, especially in the Mediterranean. It was very pleasant to cruise Norway and the British Isles in July and August with mild temperatures and not very many crowds. But that was not the case in the Mediterranean. It was sweltering and very crowded, especially in congested ports like Santorini. I've heard that cruising outside of peak season, like in the spring or fall, can make a big difference. Cruising in peak times also means everything will be more expensive, including hotels. I couldn't find any hotels in or near Barcelona in August for under $200 a night. I'll share my lessons with hotels a little later. With all this in mind, it's important to do some research when you're considering a certain cruise itinerary, because cruise lines don't provide a lot of important and practical information about each port. So my third lesson is to look very closely at the ports in each itinerary before making any final decisions about your cruise. It's safe to assume most ports will not be very close to local attractions. Use sites like What's Import to find out how far each port is from local attractions and the places you'd like to visit. Factor the amount of time you'll need to spend getting to and from those places when deciding if that itinerary or cruising overall will work for you. In ports that require a lot of logistics to get around, or there are multiple places you want to visit, shore excursions can take a lot of the work and stress out of the process, but they also add on a lot of costs. Research the cost of shore excursions for the ports you're considering to make sure the total cost of the trip will still fall within your budget. There are several reputable companies you should consider that provide a cheaper alternative to the cruise lines, including Shore Excursions Group and Viator. Another detail to look at is how the cruise line will be visiting each port. If the ship has to anchor and use tender boats, then that'll take time away from experiencing the places you want to visit. In South Queensferry, tenders to and from the port not only took up more than an hour of the day, they also narrowed the window of actual time to visit Edinburgh, since the last tender left an hour before the ship was scheduled to leave. The ship was in port for 11 hours, but with tenders and the time to travel to Edinburgh, you really only had about 7 hours in the city, and that's if you were on the first tender boat in the morning. Most ports have shuttle options like the Edinburgh bus I mentioned, but the pricing, frequency, and comfort level of the shuttles vary dramatically. In some British Isles ports like Kirkwall, Scotland, and Portland, England, the shuttles were frequent and free. But in other ports like Le Havre, France, they were charging a hefty fee to not go very far. So it takes some research to find out what's available and where. That leads me to my next lesson, which is that cruise lines don't make it easy for you to plan your own day in ports where logistics are required. On their websites, they only tell you about the excursions available, and there's no information about how to get to the destinations they say they're going to on your own. In most cases, during my 2 months cruising Europe, the cruise lines didn't provide information about shuttle buses and the cost, if there were any shuttle buses at all, until a night or two before we arrived to the port, which isn't really helpful for most people who want to plan their precious little time in port well in advance. In some ports, you can catch a hop-on, hop-off bus right outside of the port area, which makes it really easy to explore the city on your own. But this often isn't an option because the port is so far away from everything. The best all-in-one resource to find out what is and isn't available at each port, and to find out how many other ships will be in port on any given day, is the website I mentioned, What's in Port. It's not perfect and doesn't offer as many specifics as I'd like on the points of interest it recommends, but it does help streamline some of your research. Princess does have handy port guides for many popular ports that have a lot of really helpful information packed into a few pages, but they don't let you access them until you're on board the ship. These kinds of guides would be much more helpful if you could get your hands on them after booking the cruise, or better yet, while you're still shopping for the cruise. I collected as many of these port guides as I could, and you can find them on my website, thechillcruiser.blog, where I also post restaurant menus and daily programs for every cruise. Another thing I learned was that some ports are a lot more welcoming than others. My British Isles cruise stopped in Holyhead, Wales, where there wasn't much to do. There was no shuttle into town, and it was clear the locals didn't want to have anything to do with cruise passengers. My friend and I stepped into a bakery halfway through our ship's call, and they told us we couldn't eat inside because they were about to close. Contrast that with Kirkwall, Scotland a few days later, where there were free shuttle buses into town, and tourism officials were everywhere answering questions and providing maps. Over-tourism is an issue for several Mediterranean ports like Santorini, which was very crowded when I visited, and recently implemented a €20 fee per cruise passenger on top of a cap on the number of cruise passengers that can visit every day. Back to the subject of transportation. With many ports far from destination cities, this also adds complexity if your trip starts or ends in one of those ports and you need to get there from the airport. London's main port is Southampton, which is as far as 2 hours away from airports like Gatwick. I mentioned Rome, which is 2 hours away from the port. Barcelona is another major embarkation port for North American cruises, which luckily is a much more reasonable 20 to 30 minutes drive from Barcelona Airport. I took the train from downtown London to Southampton, and that was one of many times where I experienced the contradictions of European rail travel. The rail networks are extensive and can take you almost anywhere quickly and efficiently, but the process of getting on and off the train and to my final destination wasn't as smooth as I thought it would be. I got lost for about an hour trying to find the exit from one massive London Underground subway station to the train station because of poor signage. That train station was the largest in the UK, but had only one set of bathrooms that were very hard to find and were only accessible by stairs. So I had to lug my 50-pound suitcase up and down stairs to use the bathroom. The only accessible bathroom was out on the street, and you had to find a staff member to let you in. On the train, there were no luggage racks, so you had to squeeze your suitcase in front of the seat beside you, which wasn't ideal, and it was awkward when the train was busy and people were looking for seats. When I got to Southampton, I had to lug my suitcase up and down several sets of stairs again to leave the station and cross a bridge to get to my hotel. When I was taking the train from Amsterdam to the port of Rotterdam, which is another major European port, the signage was also very confusing, so it wasn't straightforward trying to figure out which track I needed to be on to catch my train. The tracks were indicated by the end destination, which isn't indicated on your ticket, so I had to ask around to figure out which track to be on. And after finally finding the right track and getting on the train, it had to go back to the station shortly after leaving because of a technical issue. And it was very chaotic trying to figure out how to get to the next train. This was very stressful knowing the ship was leaving from Rotterdam in a few hours. In both cases, I did make it to where I was going with lots of time to spare, but the journey was very stressful. If you want a smooth journey with no surprises to ports far from airports like Southampton, Civitavecchia, and Le Havre, one of my big lessons was to resist the temptation to save money on transportation and pay for a transfer. Cruise lines offer transfers that can make sense for long trips like London to Southampton. I used the Welcome Pickup service for the 45-minute journey from the port of Athens to Athens Airport, and it was a very smooth process with reasonable rates that were more expensive than taxis and ride-sharing apps, but it guaranteed me a comfortable ride at the time I needed because I had to catch an early flight. One of the preconceived notions from my previous experiences in Europe many years ago was that they're so far ahead of North America when it comes to transit and rail, especially compared to places like my hometown of Toronto. Up until very recently, you had to line up at the subway station every month to get a discounted monthly pass, and only cash fares were accepted. Since they now allow you to tap your credit card or debit card to pay for your fare, I thought this would be the norm throughout Europe, but that was definitely not the case. When I tried to tap my credit card at the entrance to the subway at Barcelona Airport, it beeped at me, and station staff angrily pointed to the ticket machines, which weren't tourist-friendly and felt like a relic from many decades ago. Instead of asking where you're going to figure out which kind of ticket you needed, you had to know which zone you were headed to and which ticket made the most sense for your journey. It ended up taking me about 15 minutes to figure out which ticket to buy because of all the different fare zones and options. My hotel was only a short subway ride from the airport, but it ended up taking a lot longer because I didn't realize the station I needed to get off at had almost the exact same name as the station before it. So I got off at that station, which had no air conditioning and was completely shut down. So I had to wait 10 minutes for the next train and get off at the next station. So if you're planning on taking subways in Barcelona or anywhere in Europe, research the type of ticket you'll need in advance and note the exact name of the station you need to get off at, because some station names are very similar. And if you thought the subway networks were big and confusing, it gets worse with longer distance rail lines, where there's multiple rail lines in each country with different rules, fares, and classes of service. If you're going to plan any rail journeys while you're in Europe, I would definitely recommend the Trainline app because it integrates all of the major rail lines and networks in one place. So if your trip requires tickets on different rail lines, the app will book them for you with one tap. On that train trip I mentioned to Rotterdam from Amsterdam, even though it was an express trip, it required 2 separate tickets for some convoluted reason, and the method to buy the second ticket is even more convoluted. But the Trainline app took care of all of it, and after paying for the trip, I had both required tickets in my trip wallet. I used the app in the Netherlands and the British Isles, and it was a lifesaver. It does charge a small fee for each ticket, but it's totally worth it, considering all the time and grief that it saves you. When you need to make short trips, I also learned in Barcelona not to rely completely on ride-hailing apps like Uber. There were close to 50 people in the lobby of my hotel who were all waiting for an Uber. Their network was so busy that Uber couldn't find me a driver and said I had to try again later. I walked a few steps outside of the hotel, and within a minute, I hailed a cab and I was on my way. I have no doubt that the people waiting for Uber in the lobby were going to wait a half hour or more just to get assigned a driver, let alone start moving to wherever they wanted to go. was surprised by air travel in Europe as well, which you keep hearing in North America as being more passenger-friendly and more generous with compensation when things go wrong. This is another example of a contradiction in Europe. The network is vast and the price is generally more affordable, but the experience was disappointing. On my flight from Manchester to Barcelona, I had paid to reserve my seat in the exit row for more legroom. But I learned as I was boarding that the aircraft had been changed and I no longer had extra legroom. When I told the flight attendant, she wasn't very sympathetic and said I was lucky to be on the plane. Since it was smaller than the plane we were supposed to be on, several passengers had been bumped. When I tried to get a refund for the fees I paid to select my seat, the airline never responded. This was worse than my experiences with Canadian Airlines because they usually give you a heads up when the plane changes and alert you to a seat change. Although they usually decline requests for compensation or refunds, they do at least formally respond to tell you. I should mention though that every one of the 3 flights I took in Europe was on time, which is definitely not the case in Canada and the US. One pleasant surprise was when I was flying from Amsterdam to London for my British Isles cruise. I hadn't prepaid for checked luggage, which was going to mean a fee of close to $100 Canadian. The day before my flight, KLM sent an upgrade offer to business class for not much more than that checked bag fee. Business class not only included checked bags, but also priority check-in and security, access to a massive lounge, and more space and service on board, including this beautifully packaged meal box. So that was another lesson. Seriously consider airline upgrade offers because they can include benefits you're going to have to pay extra for in economy anyway. Like cruise lines, many airlines allow you to also bid on a higher cabin for less than the ticket price. For my Air Transat flight to Amsterdam from Montreal, I noticed there were several empty seats in the premium club cabin. So I put in a bid close to the minimum the day before, and it was accepted within a few hours. For $250, I got a much more comfortable experience for a 7-hour overnight flight, and it was well worth it. I stayed in more than 10 hotels in the Netherlands, England, and Spain while I was on my European cruise adventure, so I have a few lessons to share in that area as well. The first is to tap into all of the discount opportunities at your disposal when booking hotels. For example, if you're a member in clubs like AAA, CAA, or Costco, they offer discounts on hotels. My TD credit card offers discounts through the Expedia site, and I found it invaluable for a few reasons. First, it offers a trustworthy aggregate rating of the property based on reviews from paying customers. Second, because they regularly offer discounts of 10 to 20% on many properties. That's how I got a discounted room at the Clarendon Hotel, just a block away from Amsterdam Airport. It was one of the coolest hotels I've ever stayed at, complete with a real 747 in its backyard. It had a free shuttle to the airport and the subway, a great self-serve market, a great cafe, restaurant, and even a movie theater. Hit subscribe and watch for my full review and tour of that hotel coming soon. I mentioned Barcelona was really expensive in August. Even hostels were over $100 a night. Since hotels right downtown were out of my budget, I ended up getting a great rate at a beautiful Renaissance hotel just outside of the city center. All I had to do was enter the corporate discount code from a former employer. That still works. It had beautiful modern rooms and a stunning rooftop pool. There are thousands of hotels throughout Europe that run under the many brands of US-owned hotel conglomerates like Hilton and Marriott. One trick that saved even more money was choosing the Pay Now option, which saved another 10% since I was comfortable with the reservation being non-refundable. Although the hotel wasn't super close to a lot of Barcelona attractions, it was steps away from the subway line and offered really nice rooms and amenities. Watch for my review and tour of that hotel, also coming soon. I think the beds in every European hotel I stayed at were comfortable, but firm. 2 of the hotels I stayed in England didn't have air conditioning, which is apparently very common for England. This meant a very hot and sticky stay at our Southampton hotel. So another tip is to not assume amenities like air conditioning are standard at every hotel, and to look closely at amenities when considering hotel. If air conditioning is important to you, make sure the property offers it before booking. And if you can't find one, pack a portable fan. Using your phone while you're traveling in Europe can get very expensive if you rely on the roaming plans offered by your cell phone provider. Rogers, my Canadian provider, wanted to charge me a whopping $16 a day, which I thought was nuts. But I discovered a great alternative option that's available to anyone with a cell phone that can use multiple SIM cards. SIM cards are the little chips you load into your phone that enable the connection between your phone and your cell phone provider. You can buy physical or virtual eSIM cards from European cell phone providers with cheap rates for talk, text, and data throughout Europe. I used a company called eSIM Options that offers physical and eSIM cards and lets you choose from a marketplace of plans from different providers. I ended up picking the Orange Holiday Europe plan, which gave me 50 gigs of data a month, as well as calls and texts within Europe and around the world for $50 US. They're now offering 100 gigs for $55 US. I'd never used an eSIM before, but it was very easy to activate. I followed the instructions while I was waiting for my flight in Montreal, and it took about 2 minutes to activate the account using a QR code. It worked immediately after we landed in Amsterdam, and I never had an issue getting a signal throughout my entire 2-month trip all over Europe. You can switch between your home SIM and the eSIM if you want, and configure which SIM is used for which function while you're away. Now I'll spend a bit of time on the cultural lessons I learned while I was exploring the many places I visited. The first surprise was the number of queue jumpers I saw on land and sea in the Mediterranean. Several times I'd be standing in this long lineup. After the person who was being helped left the counter, someone who wasn't in line would just swoop in and try to get served. Even more surprising was that staff would usually help them. If you've seen my previous videos, you'll know that I hate waiting in lines, so watching someone jump the queue just makes my blood boil. But there were several positive cultural lessons too. Something I noticed halfway through my trip was that it was easy to pay for pretty much everything with debit and credit cards, and I rarely needed cash. I had packed euros, Norwegian kroner, and British pounds, and don't remember being in a situation where cash was the only option to pay for something. I would definitely still recommend bringing the currencies for the countries you're traveling to, but you don't need much. Another pleasant surprise was how easy it was to get delicious fast food. Convenience stores everywhere I visited usually offered amazing sandwiches along with local delicacies. I'll never forget being in Bergen, Norway, looking for a very quick lunch while exploring, and found a delicious barbecue chicken sandwich in a 7-Eleven, and they even offered to heat it up for me. The options were usually 100 times better than the boring tuna and egg salad sandwiches you find at most convenience stores in Canada and the US. Okay, let's move on to what I learned about the cruise lines I sailed on throughout my adventure. My first cruise was in Norway on Holland America's newest ship, Rotterdam. Prior to this trip, I'd experienced 2 of Holland America's older ships, and even though I was impressed with the food and the service, I was disappointed with the nightlife, or lack of a nightlife. Rotterdam was a breath of fresh air with beautiful interior spaces and lots of music and nightlife options, including the fantastic B.B. King's Blues Club that turned into a nightclub after their last set. After being on several large ships with 3,500 plus people, it was also nice to be on a smaller ship with only 2,500 people, where the Lido deck was on deck 9 instead of deck 15. You can find my first impressions video for Rotterdam in the notes. Hit subscribe and watch out for my full ship review coming soon. My next cruise was in the British Isles on Regal Princess. I'd sailed on this beautiful ship several times in the Caribbean, but not in Europe. It was a treat to sail on Regal because it had a lot of features that Princess scaled down or eliminated on its newer ships, like a massive adults-only pool deck that spans the entire width of the ship, a glass walkway that's cantilevered close to 100 feet from the ship, and a casino bar. The only thing I noticed that was different compared to my Caribbean cruises was that the entertainment in the main atrium ran much later into the evening. They alternated between a sleepy husband and wife musician duo and a full party band, and their last set went close to midnight, when on Caribbean itineraries it would usually end at around 10 p.m. The music choices for both acts were fairly sedate, with many slow Beatles songs in the mix, so it did feel like a bit of a retirement home most of the time. Luckily, the party band got a nudge to play to a more diverse audience towards the end of the cruise, and that helped create a more fun atmosphere. You can find links to my updates from the ship in the notes, and my full review is coming soon. I also cruised throughout the Mediterranean on Princess's newest and biggest ship, Sun Princess, which unfortunately was very disappointing. Although the food in the cabins were very nice, the poor design and small venues made it frustrating to enjoy a lot of the entertainment and the amenities. Despite sailing for more than 6 months, the ship also wasn't finished, with construction crews working throughout the ship. One controversial family activity venue never opened because of safety issues and had to be dismantled while I was on the ship. You can find links to my many videos about Sun Princess in the notes. I also got to try MSC cruises for the first time while I was in the Mediterranean. I boarded the seaside with very low expectations based on reviews, and the cruise was pretty much what I expected, with a few surprises. First was that it felt like anything goes in most areas. You could smoke pretty much anywhere outside. The rowdy crew bar was on the bow of the ship with an earshot of 4 balcony cabins, and I could hear them singing and shouting well past midnight with my door closed. But they sure do know how to throw a fun deck party, and they rival Norwegian Cruise Line for nightlife. I did a video about the 20 differences I noticed in MSC compared to other North American cruise lines that you can find in the notes. If you've cruised Europe and learned some lessons I haven't mentioned, please share them below in the comments. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for supporting my channel. If you found this video helpful and haven't subscribed yet, I would really appreciate it if you did, because it helps me grow the channel and make more content like this. One trick that saved me a lot of money on this trip was using a credit card without a foreign exchange fee. This is one of the many tips I share in my video on how to save time and money while cruising. If you're looking to up your cruising game, this is a must-see video that you can find here. Thank you for watching, and happy cruising.